1 Kings chapter 17, and we are continuing with our legacy series. Today we're looking at a legacy of generosity. So we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 17. And I hope that you've been encouraged over the last couple of weeks to think about the legacy that you are building. Because the things that we do on a daily basis. I want you to think about generosity. Generosity is defined as the quality of being kind, of being understanding, and of not being selfish. That's really what generosity is. It is being kind, it is being understanding, and it is not being selfish. Kind, understanding, not selfish. Three things that fit together really well. And the story that we're going to read is part of a bigger narrative. There is a big deal going on here between God and the prophets of Baal, between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, about who is the real God. Is it God? Is it Yahweh, the God of the Israelites? Or is it this other God, Baal? And if you were to read more of the story than what I'm going to read tonight, you would know that Elijah says he is the only one left, and Baal has 450 prophets. And in chapter 18, there's about to be the big showdown between the one lone prophet of Yahweh and the 450 prophets of Baal. But in the midst of that, preparing to this story, there is something else going on here. God continues to be at work. And so 1 Kings chapter 17, let's get a little bit of an understanding of what's going on here. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath, where he came to the town gate. A widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah, and for the woman, and for her family. And the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. And she said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. He cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child, carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to the mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. This small narrative of the widow and her son and the cave for Elijah, it is part of this bigger story of everything that is going on, that is about to play out. And there is this overarching question: who is really God? Is it God, Yahweh, or is it Baal? Who is the God? And there'll be this big showdown between God and Baal. And as we know from the story, God wins. God sends a fire that consumes the sacrifice and licks up every last drop of water that's poured over it in chapter 18. But this morning, I want you to think about this widow. She is referred to as the widow of Zarephath. No real name is given for her. No real name is given to her or her son. In fact, we have a very limited description of this woman, but a pretty clear description of her situation. She was broke, right? She was broke. In fact, this lady was beyond broke. Now, most of us know what it's like to be broke at times, right? We know what it's like to not have the stuff that we think we need, or maybe we don't have the food in the cupboards that we want to have, or we had to break the piggy bank to go get milk. I don't know if you guys have ever had to do those things. But I bet most of us have. Most of us know what it's like at some point in our life to be broke. This lady was beyond it. She was really to the point that she was broken. She had no hope. Things weren't going to get better. She had exhausted every resource. She didn't have anywhere else to go. The cupboards weren't filled with things that she didn't really want to eat. The cupboards were completely empty. And she was going home. She was picking up sticks and going home to make one last little cake. She was going home to make a small meal for herself and her son. And they were going to eat it and die. That is beyond broke. That is really a sign of brokenness, that there was no hope. She had given up. There was no chance of things getting better for her. And I don't think that most of us have been there. We may have struggled. We may have been financially depleted. We may have felt broke. But I don't think most of us said, you know what? I'm going home to eat this last meal and die. This widow was not in a good spot. In fact, if we were in Elijah's shoes, or Elijah's sandals, how about that way? If we were in Elijah's sandals, and we were coming by and we needed something to eat, and we said to this woman, would you please bring me a drink of water? And she said, okay. By the way, she probably wasn't in the best mood, was she? Probably not. If she's gathering the sticks for her last meal, probably not really thinking, boy, I should really help someone today. I should really be kind. And so when Elijah asked her for a drink of water, it probably was an inconvenience. And then to ask a step further for a loaf of bread was a huge inconvenience. Most of us, had we been Elijah, and her response was, I am going home to make the last little scrap of food I have. I'm going to feed it to myself and my son, and then we're going to die. We would have not said, go do it anyway and bring me a cake. We would have said, oh, let me help you. Because clearly you need my help in this moment. And when we do that, we are good at doing this. We are good at looking at people and sizing them up and deciding how much they should be able to give or help. Because if somebody is driving a nice vehicle, they're in nice clothes, and they have a nice house, it means that they should have a lot of money to give. It may just mean they have a lot of debt. On the flip side, we look at someone and say, well, if they're in clothes that are kind of dirty or rags, or their car is worn out and falling apart, and maybe their house isn't the prettiest on the block, we look at them and say, oh, they probably don't have anything to give. And we make this statement of judgment and say, well, you know what, you're not able to do anything, so I'm not going to ask you. I love that Elijah doesn't do things the way we would have. Because had he done that, we probably would not have the story, or if we did, it would be a completely different story. It may be that she went home, ate her last meals, and they died. But because he didn't just look at this and say, oh, you have nothing to give, there was the possibility of hope for her. God was able to do something in her life that she didn't even think was possible seconds before. I don't even think she was asking at that point. She resolved herself to, this is where it is, this is what it'll be. And that's how I'll do this. And when Elijah asked her for help at God's prompting, the situation changed. She goes home. And have you wondered what the conversation was like in her head? I think we all process through, at least I process through stuff. And I have lots of conversations with myself, usually not out loud, sometimes. And I work through the situation, and I at least role play the conversation. I can't imagine she was overly thrilled with this imposition from Elijah. And I wonder what it was like to stand there to mix the last bit of flour and oil together and to make this cake, to smell it baking, and then to make the decision to carry it back to Elijah. That is tough. That is tough, knowing that this is your last morsel of food and you're about to give it away. You have to wonder what she was thinking as she walked back to Elijah with the bread. I can't believe I'm doing this. Is this really it? Do I really believe that what he said, that God would keep my flour and oil from running dry until the drought is over? Do I really trust in this God? Because she doesn't even identify God as her God. This is your God. Think about the trust that it must have taken. She must have thought on the way back, I'm crazy for doing this. And she probably was. Right? From all accounts, we read the story and say, of course not, because look how God provided. But we're in the midst of that. We don't always have the ending. We don't always get to see the good ending of how it's going to turn out. And for her, she's carrying this back. It had to be difficult. But imagine when she went back home and she made some bread for herself and her son. I wonder if it was just a little bit of surprise. Oh, well, maybe there's a little bit more in there than I thought. And day 2, wow, that stretched just a hair further than I thought I could go. And day 3, and day 4, and day 5, you have to wonder what she was thinking. Wow, I can't believe this is still working. I can't believe that there was still enough here that we are still able to eat because this was not where we planned to be. See, generosity is more about our willingness than about the actual gift or the amount. Generosity is all about our willingness to be kind, our willingness to be understanding, our willingness to not be selfish. And in a situation like this, the most tempting thing to do is to be selfish. I have nothing left. I'm keeping the last bit that I have for me. And that's how we're going to do this. This morning, we had all of our kids up front and Jess did an awesome children's lesson with the kids. When they came up here, the kids had 0 Tootsie Rolls, or Tootsie Pops. She gave them each 2 with the understanding that they had to give one away. You should have seen their eyes when she handed them 2 Tootsie Roll Pops. Eyes lit up. And she's telling them you have to give one away. You would not believe the hesitation in the kids to do that. In fact, I loved it. There were 2 little girls sitting right here, and I can't even remember which 2 it was. They decided to give one to each other. Isn't that perfect? Isn't that what we would do as adults? Oh, I'll feed you, you feed me. It works out, hey, look, we helped each other. We did what we were supposed to do. And some of the kids, she really had to help give one of the Tootsie Roll Pops away. Generosity is not natural. We are not good at just giving stuff away. We are good at looking out for ourselves. We are good at making sure that our needs are met, that the things that I need to have, that those things happen. And it happens early. Up until they came to this seat up front, they didn't have any Tootsie Roll Pops. They were all a gift. And the moment they had two, it was tough to give it away. And maybe we say, well, it's because they only had two. They only had two. That's why it was so hard to give it away. But do you really think it would have been a whole lot easier with 10? Probably not. You think it would have been easier with 100? Probably not. They're still giving one away. It's not really the amount, and they would have had less than what they did before. See, we are good at looking out for our own needs and making sure that we have what we want. And we have a very, very short memory on how God blesses and how God provides. The widow is a great example. We have no idea how long she was providing food for Elijah. But we know that it was long enough that her son gradually became ill and more ill and more ill and eventually stopped breathing. And in that moment, she says to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God?" Now remember that not too long ago, she was about to go home, make her last meal for her and her son, and they were going to die. And here they are, they've had food all of this time, and now it is Elijah's fault that her son is about to die. She had a short memory. So do we, right? Sometimes we are really slow learners in this, that God will provide. The woman has witnessed flour and oil appearing in her jars for who knows how long. But that all disappears in the midst of her son's sickness. It disappears in light of the newest tragedy. Boy, that's us. That's me. How easy it is for us to forget. And she turns on Elijah and his God. What do you have against me? How could you do this? And instead of asking for help, she lashes out. And we do that. We respond this way. We think we're going to make it, and it all falls apart again. Isn't that the worst feeling? The idea that we're finally going to make it, we're finally here, we're finally doing well, and then something else falls apart. How many of you stand up and rejoice when something else falls apart? We don't do that. We grumble. Yep. Maybe we swear a little under our breath. But some of us have done that, right?
No.
And we rip into God. We show time and time again that we're slow learners. Or maybe God just teaches us at a pace that we can actually understand it. I look at this. Generosity can bring life in the midst of death. This woman's generosity, her kindness, her understanding, her willingness to not be selfish, even though she probably really wanted to, brought life to her and her son and Elijah in the midst of death. Severe drought, severe famine. There was death. And yet because of her generosity, there was life. And it made an eternal difference for her, for her son, for Elijah, for all of the people who would witness about what's to happen here between the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Look at what a key part she played. We look at this as a widow who had nothing to give, and yet she is recorded as, her story is recorded in this as part of this massive narrative of the ultimate showdown between God and Baal. What a role she played. And she was ready to give up. She thought she had nothing left. And if we were to be honest, we thought she had nothing to give either. But when God is involved, God can bring life in the midst of death. It is this great hope, this reminder that we see time and time again in the Scriptures. And it brings us back to the question that this whole section is asking: who is the real God? Now, none of us here would say that Baal is the real God, right? But sometimes our checkbook is a pretty big God. Sometimes our checkbook really determines how generous we think we can be, or whether or not we can do this or we can do that, or where we're at in the scheme of life. We don't struggle with some of the false gods of those days. We struggle with, like, well, God of that day too, money, right? And this idea of generosity puts it back in perspective. You know what? Everything I have is a gift from God. Everything we have is really a gift from God. Yes, I work. Yes, I put stuff together. Yes, I have talents. Yes, I have done this. Yes, I have spent wisely. Yes, I have spent foolishly. But everything that I have really comes from God's goodness. Just like just giving the kids Tootsie Roll Pops. They didn't even know how much they wanted them until she handed them to her. Right? And then she asked them to share. And their faces. It's priceless. Absolutely priceless. I think we have the same look. Maybe we're a little better at hiding it. But this woman's generosity, it wasn't a big $1 million endowment, was it? No. Her generosity was a loaf of bread to a hungry man every day. That's generosity. A loaf of bread to a hungry man every day. And because of her generosity, it changed lives. It wasn't a large gift by any standards, but it had huge impacts. And so the question that I always want to ask at the end of every sermon is, where do we go from here? What do we do with this? Well, I think generosity is important for each and every one of us. And that ultimately the legacy that we are building should be one of generosity. It should be one of kindness, one of excellence, one of faithfulness. Not a legacy that points to us, but a legacy that really points to God. Because at the end of the day, do we want to be known as a great person? Or do we really want to be known as a person who followed God all the way to the end? Now, if we are Christians, if we are men and women of God, the answer should be the latter one. We want to be people whose lives point to God in everything that we do. That it's not about just getting the most toys, or it's not just about just having the nicest stuff. It is about making sure that everything that we have been given, we have used to the best of our abilities with God. So where do we go from here? We ask God, God, help me to listen, even when I don't feel like it. God, help me to trust you, even when I don't think it's the best idea. God, help me to do what you want, even when I know what I really want to do. And we follow God's leading. Do you realize the woman could have changed her mind on the way back? She could have gone to her home, made the bread, and never showed back up to see Elijah. That was her choice. And I suppose Elijah could have gone and tracked her down, but that really doesn't seem to fit with the biblical narrative. She could have returned and never come back, and she did. This idea of generosity, kind, understanding, and not selfish, it changes the world around us and has huge impacts. And so when I ask, where do we go from here? My hope is that you're not sitting here saying, well, boy, I would be more generous if I only had more. That's not what this story shows us. What we see is that we are generous with what we have. Whether we think it is a lot or a little, God is able to use it when we are faithful and willing to share. So let's close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this time together this evening. Thank you for the ability to read this story about this widow, this unnamed widow who gave all that she had. Her very, very last meal, because she trusted you. God, thank you for the prophet Elijah, who didn't just look at her and say, oh, you're too poor to give anything. You couldn't possibly help anyone. I should help you. God, thank you that you see the world differently than we do. Help us to trust you each and every day and to make sure that the way that we are living is a way that honors you. And God, as we build our legacy, may they be legacies that honor you. Legacies of generosity, of faithfulness, and excellence, and Christ-likeness that don't point to us, but point to you, the God of our life.